Hey everyone, welcome to the Higher Points podcast. I'm Nick Sowers here with Jeanine Long, and she's in the podcast studio with us. Nate is doing some custom harvesting, custom cutting of some hemp, so he is busy today and wasn't able to make it in. So she graciously agreed to come in, and we've been waiting to do this since January, I think 31st is what I said. Yeah, January 31st of 22 is how long we've been wanting to do this.
That's a long time.
So here we are. And so I'll just let you take it away about like who you are, what you do, and all that good stuff. Because we got to hear a little bit about you during Ted's podcast.
Okay. Do you want me to start way back when?
You can, wherever you're comfortable.
Okay. Well, I grew up in Cimarron, out in southwest Kansas. Grew up and graduated from there in 1989. I'm the old one of the bunch. And I went to school in Hayes, which is where I met Ted, actually. And then when I graduated there with my bachelor's in elementary education, I went back to Cimarron for 10 years. And I taught in Dodge and Sublette and Cimarron out in that area.
What did you teach? Like primary education?
Sixth grade.
Oh, okay.
Taught sixth grade for 6 years. Yeah. And then I became the counselor. So I did that 4 years. The last 4 years I was out there before, and then I moved to Wichita in 2004. So I lived in Wichita, and then I worked out in Jeanine for 15 years. I was a counselor at the grade school. And then in 2008, I started working as a therapist in the evenings, part-time. And so I've been doing that ever since. I had a brief break from that in 2018. I just kind of, working 2 jobs. I needed a little reprieve, so I stopped doing private practice just for a brief amount of time. And then in 2019, I left the school system to work for a startup. We were creating products to help parents and educators meet the mental health needs of kids. And then when COVID hit, our investor pulled out. And so I was unemployed for about 6 months, and then made the decision in September of 20 to go into private practice full time. And I always tell people that it was the best thing that ever happened to me. When you're 50 or just shy of 50 and find yourself unemployed, it was the head in the hands moment of, dear God, what am I going to do? But I absolutely love what I do. And I don't know if I ever would have made the leap from school to private practice full time. But it's what I was created to do. So somewhere along the way, I became a yoga teacher, and got certified in programs to teach yoga to kids and then to people with PTSD, and became a mindfulness teacher and have a handful of certifications along the way that I integrate all of that into the work that I'm so blessed to do.
So what is your educational background? Like, what are your degrees in?
So my bachelor's is in elementary education, and then my master's is in guidance and counseling. I got that at Hayes. And then to become I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor. So to do that in Kansas, you have to have a total of 60 credit hours. And then you work in a clinical setting and under supervision. And then I had to take a test, and then I had to work an insane amount of hours to take another test to get my clinical licensure. So I'm an LCPC.
So what are some of the other like highlights of other certifications that you have that maybe you're proud of, like the ones that you were really happy with?
My yoga certification, I'm a registered yoga teacher, and I came by that through a yoga program for kids came across my computer one day. So I spent about 2 weeks one summer in Minnesota getting trained in that program. And once I realized what yoga could do for mental health, that's when I started training as a yoga teacher. And that's totally changed the work that I do. And I also integrate it into my daily practice of what I do. But then and I'm not really doing much with it right now. As far, other than integrating it into my work with my clients, but I'm not teaching yoga classes. But I have done some work with veterans with a program called Yoga Warriors, and I really enjoyed doing that program. So
cool. Well, yeah. So was there some sort of a drive to, like you being drawn towards like maybe that mental health field? Was that something that like your parents did or something with your childhood? I mean, like what made you kind of steer you in that direction?
Yeah. So I'm the oldest of four. And my parents are, they were both counselors, both school counselors. They were educators first and then became school counselors. And then my dad left the school system to go to the bank out in Cimarron and did that until he retired. But I have two sisters that are in education. One was a assistant principal. Now she's a teacher, and the other is a counselor. And then my brother's at Coke in Wichita.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, I always wondered because, sometimes there's like those like trauma-induced stories of like where like my wife had like a lot of trauma on her past. So like she was like, I want to help people like work through that, of like that, be able to say like, I've been there, done that.
Yeah.
I want to help you through that kind of thing.
What's interesting about that is I was in a training and I took the ACE questionnaire. Are you familiar with that? So it's adverse childhood experiences, and it's what we use to kind of look at the trauma that people have experienced prior to the age of 18. Because when people undergo trauma prior to the age of 18, obviously we have trauma after that, but in those years, it affects them differently. It affects their bodies in a different way than it does as an adult. So it has questions about are you a child of divorce? Did you ever witness a parent being abused? Were you ever physically abused? And we just kind of use it as a starting place for working with trauma. The interesting thing about it is there's so much research out there about people with adverse childhood experiences. And it's not a predictor of, but it's related to illness in later, stages of cancer, heart disease, things like that. So, just another reason for people resolving that trauma, especially as a child. So anyway, my stories get so long.
That's the beauty of the podcast. I mean, we could be here 4.5 hours if you wanted
okay, great,
to. So
great. So anyway, I was in a training. We took the ACE questionnaire, and my ACE is 0. And I was like, what am I doing? I have no business, doing what I'm doing.
I've had those thoughts in my career as well.
Yeah. And then I realized, that puts me in a different position to be able to do what I do. Some people are like your wife and they want to give back, but then some people, we just come at it from a different perspective of, what, I've had this really great life and I want to help people that maybe haven't had the same experience.
Yeah, well, I throughout my work and my friends and my wife, I look back and I'm like, holy cow, I had this like total Leave It to Beaver childhood.
Yeah.
Like those two, just the two things that you mentioned there, the divorce, no. Have I been physically abused? No. I mean, in today's society, they would say yes because I was spanked as a child, but I personally don't perceive it that way.
Yeah, I don't either.
And people can feel free to disagree with me, but that's just my thoughts. And then, also I never saw my dad ever, like, I never saw my parents even, like, I would see them sitting down and discussing, and you could tll that there was some tension, but it was never like that screaming or like slamming a door or I'm leaving or dad was gone for the night or, anything like that. And little did I know they were actually going to marriage counseling at one time.
Oh, really?
And all I knew is we went to see this cool lady and they had this badass playground and I just went and played at the playground. Like that's all I ever knew.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting because I remember one time going to a friend's house and they were fighting and it was like the knocking things off the dresser and I was terrified.
Oh, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Cause I was just like, get me out of here. And I left.
Yeah.
Like I was like new and I couldn't even imagine being a child in that environment regularly.
Yeah.
Especially with a developing brain. And so, Nate and I, and like, I love nerding out just in general. But when it comes to the brain and like how things work and why they work and like when traumas happen, because one thing I wanted to ask you was what I was thinking there was you said from, till they're 18, that we handle things differently. But isn't the brain still like growing and forming for a little longer than that? Like, I mean, as far as it's always like ever changing, you can damage it pretty much at any time. But like, don't they say it's kind of like formative years or more to like what, 25-ish?
25, 26 is when the prefrontal cortex, the newest part of the brain, the part where we do our rational thinking is fully developed at 25 or 26. But you have to remember the brain is directly related to the body. So when they're experiencing those things prior to the age of 18, it's not only affecting their brains, but it's affecting their bodies, and their bodies remember those. In yoga, I had a teacher that always talk about the stories are stored in our bodies, or the issues reside in our tissues. And a lot of that is just, it affects the body differently in a child than it does an adult.
Well, I can even see it. And like my son, for instance, this week, Saturday, he was not looking forward to a debate tournament. Just because, getting up in public speaking and that kind of stuff. Yeah. And also we've been dealing with some mental health issues with him that I've talked about many times that you've heard since you listen to the podcast.
Every week.
Which is awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're over 3,000 listens now.
Wow.
Yeah, so pretty happy with that.
That's exciting.
And so, but to watch him manifest the stress, like he not only manifests it in, maybe taking out a little bit more aggression and anger on his brother and sister and maybe us, and not in a like not me in the sense of he's fighting me, but, maybe fighting me with words a little more.
Right.
But, once that, and then like he'll start to get like diarrhea and like the stomach cramps and it's butterfly feelings. And then once that stress is over, 110% different kid.
Oh, totally.
I mean, like it's like night and day difference, black and white.
Yeah. Yeah. What's interesting about that is I used to only work, obviously I worked with kids in the school system, but when I was in private practice, I only worked with kids also. And I did a lot of teaching them self-regulation skills. And, parents would come back the next session and say, can't get them to do what you do. And, so I was trying to teach parents what I was doing so they could do some of that same thing with kids at home. Some of the stuff that you're talking about, learning to recognize that. And then when I went into practice full time, in order to fill my schedule, I took in some adults and I was like, ooh, I like working with adults. And at first I thought it was because, I worked with kids for 25 years and I thought maybe I just need a break, but that's not like me. I love kids and I love working with kids, but what I have since realized is, and don't misunderstand me, there's a place for therapy for kids, but for me, I love working with adults and I love helping the adults learn some of the things that you've talked about. And then that way they can recognize that in their kids, and then they are there to help their kids. You having that understanding of what's going on in the brain, and you having that understanding of what's going on in the body, you're able to help him. And if I'm helping adults, resolve some of their own trauma, they are able to parent their kids in a completely different way. So
it's like a trickle down effect.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's shifted my entire practice, and I only work with adults now.
I will say that these struggles with Eli have been probably the most insurmountable, like seeming things that I've ever done in my entire life. It's harder than being married. It's harder than being a cop. It's the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. End of story. but I would say that it has transformed me in a way to where, like, I responded to a call the other day where I was telling a kid, I was like, let me tell you what you're feeling. Cause I was like, put a word to, I was like, first I told him, I asked him, I said, what are you feeling? And he was like, what? I'm like, give me an emotion. Anger, sadness, mad, like what? And he was having trouble, kind of placing, and Elijah does too,
right,
of putting that in there. Yeah. And so I was like, how about this? Let me take some stabs in the dark. And he was like an adopted child, same way as Eli.
Right.
And I'm like, anger. And he was kind of like, yeah, loneliness. Yeah. And then also like that wonder of, worthiness. Am I worthy? Why did my parents give me up, etc.? And it was just kind of like seeing, like, he was kind of like, whoa.
Yeah.
And being able to like calm him down out of crisis to where it's like, okay, now we can move into the rational thought side of things.
Right.
Which has really helped me throughout the course of my job.
Yeah.
And, like one time I was at the hospital with a kid and I told the doctor, I was like, oh, I'm sorry. I'm like, I didn't mean to talk over you. She goes, no. She's like, whatever you're doing, just keep doing that. And I'm going to go and we'll do some paperwork and stuff. And she's also the one that does the med checks with like Eli and stuff too. So she knew, kind of what we're doing.
Yeah.
And speaking on the med checks, I have some questions there too.
Okay.
So I just, I guess we could just get right into it on some things. Like I really want to like hit some like secondary traumatic stress type things. The stuff with like the media kind of keeping on edge.
Yeah.
And then, maybe talk also about some like resources and also maybe some common misconceptions and things like that. So like I guess that's one of the questions that's kind of been on my mind is we've kind of gone from like, I was a very, I guess strict would probably be the best word of like expecting like Elijah to get like A's and essentially demanding perfection of someone that can't be perfect. Mm-hmm. And some of the damage was because of me and because of how I parented. And so we move into the crisis and then to him being hospitalized and then growing through this and also me being in therapy for a short period there and learning some things and getting some things out as well. And then now I'm at the point where I'm like, okay, we were treating him kind of like with kid gloves on things. And I told my wife, I'm like, okay, he's in a good place now. The medications kind of help level out to where the peaks aren't so high and the valleys aren't so low. And we're in this point where like I want him to start experiencing a little bit of life again. Like he's going to have to go out in the real world someday and experience the lows and try to do the self-soothing and try to figure out ways to navigate those.
Right.
And so what I'm wanting to get there is like, at what point do you, because I think a lot of people sometimes, for at least my experience in law enforcement, and I'm not playing like I'm the expert here, is people like to sometimes let that trauma define them. Like that's who I am and that's where they're always going to be and they can never like move past it. So like for me, I'm a very matter of fact person. So sometimes I want to look at my son and say, that's not you. We're moving past it. We're done. Mm-hmm. Like, that's to me, like, but I know that's probably not the right like verbiage to use that.
Yeah.
So how do you kind of help people move past that? Like, this isn't what defines you. There's another person that you can be. This isn't what life is. You can make it what you want it to be.
Yeah. Well, first things first, I think the majority of parents are doing the best they can with what they have, right? So you parenting the way you were parented is a very natural thing, so I feel like that's important to put out there first. Beyond that is something that my clients hear all the time is, it's either an explanation or it can be an excuse, right? And maybe it's the educator in me, but I spend a lot of time teaching clients about, in very first session, I'm teaching them about their brain and I'm teaching about those brain flipping moments. And I teach them about their, the connection between the mind and the body. And we talk about neuroplasticity. And so it reshapes the vocabulary that they have. And I'll never forget, I was working with a man he was probably in his 40s and his ACE score was an 8. And is
that high?
That's high.
Okay.
10 is the highest it can be.
Okay. Yep. So it's a 0 through 10 scale, and the higher the number, the basically the quote unquote worst for that scale.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. His was an 8, and as I'm explaining his brain, the body, and the neuroplasticity, like his, eyes are just filling with tears, and he said, nobody has ever taught me that. And he said, now I understand, and I could just see the relief, and he visibly, physically sighed, and so for him, it became an explanation of all of these things, substance abuse and all of these things that he's experienced through his life. So trauma, it's an explanation. This is why versus an excuse. Oh, I can't do that. I have trauma. It's the same thing, with any diagnosis, ADHD, anxiety, which, in all fairness, full disclosure, you asked me earlier, part of my story that I left out is not intentionally, but I have an anxiety disorder, and it's been a part of me. I can think about things in kindergarten that I know were anxiety based. We just didn't know it was anxiety at the time. And that's been quite a journey for me. I was 37 before I actually sought therapy for myself, and saw a therapist for a while, stopped, and that's been something I've done on a couple different occasions, and was even on medication for a short amount of time. But it's become an important piece of what I do. I feel like I have an understanding with clients. I work with a lot of clients with anxiety, and they'll often say, you just get it in a different way. And I'm completely honest with them. But there again, anxiety for me could be an excuse for a lot of things. And it has been, at different points in my life. I can't do that. I'm too anxious, or, I wasn't going to say that out loud, but, but then it became, I guess in some ways a good excuse, because it's what drove me to become a yoga teacher. It's what drives me to do a lot of what I do. So, yeah.
So that was also, in a way, also kind of therapy for you, in the sense of it gave you the opportunity to find that was your self-soothe, that was your way to overcome what was basically holding you back.
Dude, the joke in my family, are you doing that for your clients or for yourself? And I'm like, if it benefits everybody, what's the big, it doesn't matter.
Win-win. Win-win-win.
Yeah.
Win-win-win.
Yeah.
So, you talked a little bit about the anxiety, and I will say, I can't ever remember a time ever of being anxious about anything until probably this stuff with Eli, the catalyst of like that like earth-shattering moment where I realized that my son was having suicidal thoughts.
Right.
And so then, to me, the anxiety, now I find myself, where is he at? Is he safe? Once I know that he's home and he's in his bed, that's kind of where I'm good. And I don't do that all the time.
Yeah.
It just depends. Like days that I know he's angry, and one of the safe spaces that he identified was just, there's a field behind our house with trees, which is where he went and was, saying he was going to hang himself. So when they put that in the safety plan, I was like, is that a good idea? But, again, just through parenting and trusting the process of, like, he goes out, he does whatever it is he does out there, and he comes back in and it's different, and rather than just, harping on him constantly. So what I'm getting at on the anxiety side is it's interesting. It's an interesting feeling. It's almost like those times when you make plans with people and you're like, yeah, like today, I was like so excited for today, but I have to admit, like about 45 minutes before we were supposed to be here, a little bit of the anxiety started hitting of like how's it going to go? Is it still going to be fun? Is it going to be organic? Like, is it going to go or am I going to ask questions the right way? And so you get those. So when it comes to anxiety, like I have a question on that. So like for me, I'm pretty hard on myself because I feel, like we're rooted in scripture of like a man will like kind of leave his family and basically kind of create and have his own family. And I also subscribe to a little bit of the stoicism and the stoic mindset in the sense of if I can't control it, I try to let it fall off, or the whole leave it at the cross type concept.
Right.
But I'm exceptionally hard on myself in the sense that I look at myself in the mirror and I say like, you're doing a good job, but there's always room for improvement. And so sometimes it's like there's this never ending cycle of you got to be better. So is there a point with which that, I guess, maybe becomes a bad thing?
Unhealthy.
Yeah, unhealthy. There we go. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
It's almost like you do this for a living or something.
Oh, I know. Wow. How about that? You know, can I have one of those?
Yeah.
You talk about things and I'm like, oh, I got to talk about this. I got to talk about this.
Why do you think I'm making notes
I
doing
know.
the exact
I
same
should've gotten
thing?
the same thing.
It's like I've done this before.
Oh, right. Okay, you mentioned something that I think is important for me to touch on, and then you're going to have to like remind me what the question is because I'll forget. So you were talking about doing something instinctually with Eli, and I think that's the thing that you have to focus on is I have a lot of parents that I work with, and they'll say, I read this in this on this blog that I follow, or this, this person that I follow posted this on social media. And sometimes they get so bogged down in that, or they'll learn a parenting program and then, they'll say, well, in the moment I couldn't remember what I was supposed to do. And I always say, follow your instincts, right? Even though, how old was Eli when he was little, right?
He would have been in 5th grade when we first kind of came to that realization that he was it was kind of mounting up on him. So what is that, like 12, 10, 12, 10, 11, 12, somewhere around there?
Yeah. So, and how old was he? He was little when you came into his life, right?
Andrew was still pregnant with him.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So, those instincts of knowing what to do with him have been developing, for years. And so even in 5th grade, when that started, you're anxious about it and you're scared, but always go back, trust your gut, those instincts that are there of what to do. And you saw a therapist and you learned some tools, but those all become part of that gut instinct to know what to do in that moment. Talking about, going to the field, there's so much research out there on nature, and nature in and of itself can be so nurturing. So is it scary to think about him going out there to that place? Yes. But that's also a place where he can find a lot of nurturing.
Well,
too.
that's what he identified as well. That's kind of what I want.
Yeah.
So that's the important part there too.
Yeah. Yeah. So wanted to mention those. Okay, what was your question? I forgot.
So, I was just talking basically about that, as from a parenting aspect and from just a person aspect in general, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're married or unmarried, of just essentially kind of holding yourself a little bit too much of a higher standard. I had a 15-year-old young man break me down into tears in the gym when he looked at me and said, he's like, hey, I'll try not to cry here. He said, hey, man, give yourself a little bit of grace.
Yeah.
Because he knew what was going on with Eli because he was struggling with some of the same things. And, his parents kind of had abandoned him. And so, but just give yourself a little bit of grace. Stop being so hard on yourself,
right.
Kind of thing. So, basically, when does that, I guess, become unhealthy?
Unhealthy, right. I think the answer to that is, it varies from one person to the other, obviously based on, their nervous system. But when it becomes uncontrollable, right? The anxiety that you experienced before you came here was that anxiety that helped you prepare, right? When I came in here, I could tell that you had jotted some things down. That's a healthy amount of anxiety because it helped you be prepared. If it was anxiety to the point where you couldn't concentrate, you couldn't function, you couldn't move away from it, that's when it becomes unhealthy. It's kind of that double-edged sword. I love how much people are talking about mental health, but sometimes I worry because the conversation has become so great about, I have anxiety, everybody has anxiety.
Yeah.
Anxiety is a part of who we are. We want to have anxiety so we don't, go out here in the middle of the street and do stupid shit. Anxiety is a good thing in that way. But when it reaches that point where, like I said, it's unhealthy, it's because we can't move away from it, or it's our sole focus. And
well, it's interesting you say that, because the note that I'm making right now is one of the things I told my therapist was, one of the anxieties that I had was, if I'm acknowledging this and I'm acknowledging these feelings and these things that I'm feeling, like, am I going to perpetually now be in this loop of, like, now that's what defines me. Now that's who I am. Like, how do I get out of that loop of, I'm feeling this anxiety or this sadness or this anger, because there were so many things wrapped up in there. Angry at myself, angry at Elijah for some of the things he did, so on and so forth. Of, like, I was really worried about, like, now that I've acknowledged this, how do I now, like, move past it, so it's not like this perpetual, like, waves rolling and just hitting the shore over and over and over.
Well, I think you use the important word. It's acknowledgement, right? Like, I acknowledge this anger, I acknowledge this anxiety, and the next step after acknowledgement is acceptance, right? I'm angry about this. Now I can accept that I'm angry about this. Help yourself understand why, and then move past it. And I think that's a point that's important for me to make, is I've heard you 3 times now talk about acknowledging emotions. And do you have any idea how many males, number one, they don't identify emotions. They won't acknowledge or even begin to accept their emotions, but you are very well versed in that, and you're helping not only your son, but these kids, that you're having these very meaningful conversations with. I mean, you have no idea the difference that you're making with them.
Yeah, but the downside is I've only got 30 minutes with them sometimes, versus their families and their life, and like there's that other 23 and a half hours a day that I'm not there.
True, but you're planting a seed. And, sometimes that seed is there and it grows at a different point, but you're at least planting that seed. Yeah.
Well, and it's also a foreign concept to me to not acknowledge it in a way. And that was never something that, she doesn't listen to the podcast, so I'll say this. My mom is very much not, like, on board with this whole, like, mental health and medicine and all that other kind of stuff. And my mom grew up a adult child of an alcoholic. And so, she's very much of the, like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of, thought process on some things. So this has been interesting because, she is held in very high regard in my mind.
Right.
So battling some of that and realizing what is healthy and what's unhealthy for me has been an interesting experience.
Right.
But so never did I ever remember saying, like, well, what are you feeling? Like, never that. But I mean, I have those conversations with Eli of, like, what are you feeling right now? And sometimes it's like, I don't know. And I have to just, okay.
So where did you learn that?
I don't know.
Who modeled that for you?
I don't know. I can't think of one.
Really?
Yeah. I have no idea. It's
coach, teacher.
I didn't do sports.
Oh, true.
I mean, I did baseball, but that was like until just high school. So
That's interesting.
I don't really know. Maybe my wife, because, she worked in, mental health with kids in St. Francis, and, before St. Francis was awful. Anyway, and like Horizons and stuff like that, and everything. So maybe that's where, cause, I used to be that, like, shut it down, like, we'll talk about it later kind of thing. And she was just like, no, she would always fight. Like, no, we need to, like, talk about this kind of stuff.
Good for her.
And it's definitely been a growth process on both sides.
Right.
But it's also weird to me because it just doesn't make sense to me. I'm like, how do you expect to progress or be better or anything if you're not willing to just, because it's very natural. It's very natural to be happy. It's also very natural to feel a depressive feeling.
Right.
From time to time, again, as long as it's not unhealthy.
Right.
And the point with which it becomes unhealthy, seeking that assistance.
Right. Well, it's just like anger. Even early on in my career, we were talking to kids about managing your anger, not getting angry. Oh, everybody gets angry.
Yeah.
It's a healthy emotion. What's unhealthy is the way we express it sometimes, or the way we don't express it.
Well, and another thing I was reading, Raising Emotionally Intelligent Children.
Yeah.
It's a book, and you probably know it maybe. But anyway, in there, he was like, I didn't realize that I was being one of those parents. Like, I would literally, like, if my kids were feeling sad or mad or whatever, like, I was that parent that would, like, tickle them to get them to come back to that happy state.
Yeah.
Which after reading that, was like, while that's not awful,
right,
that's not probably the most healthy thing, because again, they are going to experience those emotions later on in life, and they need to know how to feel them and how to work through them.
Right.
And watching that is like, sometimes it's almost like watching your kid jump off this cliff knowing they're going to break their legs.
Right.
Like, I want to tell you, stop, don't.
Yeah.
But there are times that, not that kids breaking their legs is healthy, but
right,
just illustrating the point.
Right.
The best way I like to explain parenting is, it's like taking the most razor sharp knife you have ever seen in your life, taking this delicate banana and trying to balance it on top of this without cutting it or damaging it in any way.
Yeah.
Like, it is literally sometimes that fine on things. And then it's also very different with each kid. So that's even more maddening as well.
I had a parent, let's see, it was probably my third or fourth year I was a teacher, and she said, I'm not going to listen to a thing you have to say. You're not a parent. You don't know what it's like. We're done here. And that stuck with me, and it probably negatively affected me for a lot of years. But it's, probably drove me to educate myself more. But even with all the education in the world, to be a parent and to actually be there, it's the hardest job in the world. I can't imagine.
Yeah, it's not always awful. Like, I sit in here and I talk about the bad things, but like, because there are times that it's phenomenal. Like, I've got one of my favorite videos that I've ever seen is I'm getting out of my patrol car, walking up to the house, and my children are literally running to the door. Brooklyn's small enough. She's still in one of the pack-and plays, jumping up and down because she's so happy to see me. Yeah. So it's not all that, but it's hard because when you're in the moment and you're in the minutia and you're in that valley, the valley seems so deep and insurmountable and dark, and like, you can't see anyone else around you. And it seems like everybody else in today's day and age of social media, everyone else is on the mountaintop. Everybody up there is living the life.
Right.
And again, another thing I'm telling my kids is everyone else is struggling just like you. They may not be struggling with depression.
Right.
Maybe they're struggling with substance abuse. Maybe they're struggling with a parent that doesn't love them, or maybe they're struggling with, a divorced household. Like, they're struggling in some way. And it's pretty interesting because Eli's starting to identify that.
Yeah.
And he'll go, hey, I was talking to so-and-so today. He goes, I didn't realize it. He goes, but she or he are struggling the same way as me. And so now we have some common ground. And I said, you never know what you may be accomplishing there, because they may have never started talking about it had it not been for you.
Right.
And so that's like, when things come up like that, I'll be the first person to break the ice.
Yeah.
Like, I'll just throw it out there.
Yeah.
And then you watch the group just from there, just, it's like an explosion.
Right. Right.
So back on to, the anxiety. So a common way, at least that I've seen in my job, and then also with Eli, was I shouldn't say the first step, because I was really hesitant to just want to give my kid pills. Like, that was my hesitation. Right. Not to say that I was dead set against them, because that's not what I was, but we worked through a lot of things of, like, maybe if we go camping and get away from things, or like all these different things. And then when like they didn't work, and we finally kind of had that realization of, we've tried things. The only thing we really haven't tried is hospitalization and maybe medication.
Right.
And so that is what is so far working and helping. So I'm curious of what I've noticed is, during the summer when Eli wasn't in school, the peaks and valleys were, more like a sine wave, like a really manageable sine wave.
Right.
Now that school started, those peaks and valleys are a little bit more defined.
Yeah.
So when we go for a med check, is that something, and even if other parents are thinking this as well that may be listening in, should we maybe look at increasing doses for temporary periods of time, leave it the way it is? And again, you're probably going to say it depends on the kiddo and stuff like that. But I'm just curious of what your thoughts on that are.
You're right. It depends on the kiddo. Every person's body metabolizes medication differently, right? So that's always something to consider, as far as advice when it comes to meds. But yeah, I think that's important to mention to the doctor, because that person is with you for 15 minutes and, you have this huge all-encompassing view that you can give them. But, you think about the summer and the stressors aren't there in the same way that they are when school starts. My 2 bits on meds, of course, I don't prescribe medication. But here's the way I explain it. And for me, it was this way too. I remember the first time I was in therapy, I was just so exhausted of dealing with anxiety. It was just consuming my life. And I remember saying to my therapist, "You think I need meds?" She's like, "No, we're going to do some therapy. You'll be good." Summers were always hard for me because I had so much extra time on my hands, and that's when my anxiety would just, get I
didn't have anywhere to put your brain power.
Dude, got all wrapped around the axle during the summer. So one summer, I recognized it was getting worse, and I kept thinking, when I go back to school, it'll be better. When school started, I couldn't get out of bed. I had reached the point of depression. So I went back to the therapist. She's like, I think you need to see the doctor for meds. I'm like, I don't need meds. You need meds. So here's the way I look at it. So when you're at a certain level, you're accessing your tools, right? Eli can access his tools when he's functioning at this level. Sometimes we're functioning down here, And if this is the point that we have to be functioning up here to access our tools, we have to have something to bridge this gap. And so meds can do that to where we can access those tools. And that's what happened to me. I was way down here. So I had to have meds for a certain amount of time to raise my level of functioning so I could access the tools that I knew how to use. And then that's when yoga came in, and I started meditating. I started doing all of these mind-body practices and changing, trying to change the way I eat and move my body, and developed enough tools that I don't have to take meds anymore. But when things get really stressful, I'm like, maybe I should start on meds again. You know what I mean? But those are all important things to bring to the doctor. And yeah, there's probably certain times when meds can increase and when they can be lowered. But again, it's all depends on the individual.
So at what point do you kind of then maybe make the decision of, because that was something I talked to Eli, he had a huge aversion to medication. Mm-hmm. In the sense he somehow perceived medication as making him weak. And I have no idea where that came from, because never once was that something that was ever said by Andrea or I.
Right.
So getting him to take that, because at first it was kind of like that, we're going to trust you, and then I went and I was counting the pills behind the scenes. Like, I knew where the pill bottle was just to kind of see.
Yeah.
And, there was like 15 days that hadn't been taken, and I'm like, whoa, like big deal, and so we've since kind of, and he did the whole, I forgot kind of thing. And so
right.
Like, okay, here it is every day, watch it take it. I'm not doing the whole prison show me under your tongue or anything.
Right.
But you can definitely tell.
Yeah.
You can definitely tell if a couple of doses have been missed.
Yeah.
You can tell. But when do you kind of make the decision to, like, maybe we should try to wean off this? Because that was one thing I told him. I'm like, hey, you don't have to do this for the rest of your life. It's not like this is some death sentence.
Yeah.
Like, when does that kind of happen?
Usually for a lot of people, it's, when their mood seems to be stabilized and they're able to access their skills consistently. And, you can look at a period of, maybe we can start backing off meds a little bit, obviously with, the doctor's recommendation.
Yeah, right.
Because sometimes people stop taking meds just cold turkey, and you should never do that. But, talking to the doctor about reducing the dosage a little bit. And, okay, how are we doing? Are we using our skills? Are we using our tools? No, got to go back. It's just kind of playing with it a little bit. Something I didn't know about until probably the last 2 or 3 years is gene site tests. Are you familiar with that? So it's something the doctor can give that will help people see which medications metabolize best.
I have heard about this.
Yeah, within their bodies, and you get a list. The green list. These are medications you should take. Yellow, maybe not. Red, these are not going to do.
Yeah, I've seen them a lot when in my line of work when we're dealing with people that have some of the more, I guess, quote unquote rare mental illnesses like bipolar schizophrenia, or maybe they're on the spectrum and maybe we're trying to figure out what meds are going to work. They really like to use those because it's it's maybe a little harder to get them to talk about how they're feeling and what they're feeling and stuff. So I have heard about that.
Yeah. So.
But so basically, if I can just paraphrase on that, is essentially, again, really no black and white rule, but just a conversation. So should that be a conversation with therapist, doctor, all around, kind of what we're feeling, what we're seeing, and then with doctor's recommendations, kind of decide like we're weaning down off of that.
Yeah.
And
doctor, therapist, Eli, mom, dad. Yeah. Everybody. I'm a firm believer in that integrated, holistic, everybody involved therapy.
Yeah.
Treatment.
And that's one thing that we've told his therapist is like, we're all on board. Like even Brooklyn and Alex are like, we'll go too.
Yeah.
Of just like, talking through things. Cause I like to tell him of like, this is how you're making me feel.
Right.
Not just only like, I know how I'm making you feel. Like maybe when I hold you accountable and you don't like that.
Right.
But like also so that he can kind of see because, there are times he can be downright rude and every kid can, not just him.
Right.
But, I try to illustrate those points when somebody's doing it back to him.
Yeah.
Of like, this is a taste of your own medicine. See how you're being made to feel. So I agree with that approach. And she's like, still kind of trying to break through some of that exterior with him of doing that. She's like, so I'm very much on board with that, but I'll let you know when we're kind of ready type thing. And I've just trusted that process.
Yeah.
But at what point do we now then get into where like maybe medication is a crutch? Because I have seen times where, it's almost like, I'm just illustrating a point here. I've never seen this, but it's like somebody takes their medication and they swallow it and that's their last one. And now they move into crisis because now they're out of meds, or, I can't get to that, or, I missed one day and now it's like back into like full-fledged, we haven't made any progress crisis mode. Is that something like, I'm trying to illustrate this point without sounding crass, but like sometimes I see things where maybe sometimes medications are maybe over prescribed or even used as a crutch sometimes.
Yeah.
And so what's your experience with that? I mean, do you have people that like just completely rely on that of like, just like I need my doctor to prescribe me a fuck it all and that way everything's fine?
Yeah. Well, even me, like, that's why I said sometimes I just think to myself, life would be easier if I went back on my meds because, I mean, I get up hours before I have to go to work because I'm very intentional about how I show up with my clients. So I allow time for the gym. I allow time for prayer, meditation, yoga, because I know I need all of those things to get my body and my brain in a place where I can offer my best self to my clients. And would my life be simpler if I could just do all of that with meds? Absolutely. But for me, it was a decision of, I'm going to go off meds. I'm going to try it without, see what I can do. Always knowing that if I need to go back on, I can. Right? So I think it becomes a personal decision. Obviously there are things where people are going to have to be on meds the rest of their lives. But yeah.
Well, see, because like some of the aversion that I've seen, at least among like law enforcement officers and first responder professionals, are you can lose your certification for mental health reasons. Now, it's not like every time an officer goes on an antidepressant, KC Post, which is the Kansas Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training. They're basically the people that say you're a cop. it's not like every time you go on an antidepressant, like they're pulling people's certifications. But I think that's a little bit of the aversion to first responders and cops even acknowledging any of it.
What is that? Tell me what that means, certification. Like certification to...
Yeah, as a
be
law
a cop?
enforcement officer. Yeah, so you have to go to you have to go to a 14-week academy.
Right.
At which point you get a certification from KC Post to be a law enforcement officer.
So if you're getting mental health treatment, you could
yes.
lose your certification to be a police officer.
And potentially never be a law enforcement officer ever again. It's in statute.
What the hell?
I agree. So if you were sitting on some sort of a board or some sort of, because like, let's face it, there are times that, and I'm going to use a really overarching term that may make you cringe.
Okay.
But there are times that, sometimes people are just broke and sometimes broken, maybe beyond repair.
Right.
Because of maybe what they've experienced.
Right.
And so if you were sitting on some sort of a board and you were being questioned by a governing authority like the legislature or whatever because they were looking to change that law, like what were some things you'd advocate for? Because obviously we need to make sure that our law enforcement officers are mentally healthy. They have to make life and death decisions in an instant. But at the point with which, again, here we are, that sharp knife I was talking about and balancing the banana, where do we then draw the line to where law enforcement officers and first responders, because I don't know what it's like in the fire and EMS world, but to where they don't have to be fearful of admitting that and getting help. Like how do you, if you were to being asked that question, how would you change that to make it more accommodating? What would you say?
To make mental health more accommodating?
Yeah. So to where you wouldn't have to be worried about being, lose your certification. Like, where do you draw the line?
Well, okay. So let's look at it this way. Why could you potentially lose your certification?
Like other reasons other than that?
No, with the mental health. So I have mental health issues. I could potentially lose my certification as a police officer. It's
basically kind of broad in the sense of you have, like, if you're found to be kind of like unfit or whatever, I can maybe find the statute while we're sitting here talking, but because I was looking at it because there was a gentleman that was like going through that process where he was at work, got dispatched to a baby that he performed CPR on, and the baby did not live. And he took that very hard, at which point he sought mental health treatment. And then I have to keep in mind this. There's 3 sides to every story. His, hers, and the truth.
Right.
But if you go, because you can read what are called certification actions. So you can go in and read why somebody had action against their certification. Like, you can read the whole, it's an open record thing as to why they went through it, why they did it. And in there, it has the reason, like it cites the statute of like what they're talking about. And in there, I remember reading in his that was one of the things that the statute talked about. And I was just looking at that because, again, I am a mental health proponent. But again, I do realize that there are times that, maybe people shouldn't be law enforcement officers anymore based on that. But I was reading that and I was like, whoa, like that was kind of, very broad, I guess. Well,
and that's probably what I would say. It needs to be more defined because, there are going to be instances where you don't want them, doing their job. But I guess I would look at that as, why would you not want them getting help? There's so much out there about the benefits of mental health and what happens if we don't resolve trauma and, PTSD. And I guess my question would be, why, like I said, why wouldn't you want them to get help? I think it needs to be discussed and I think it needs to be more defined.
Yeah. And so that kind of brings me a great segue into the next point is, I just recently learned the term, although it's not something that is new, and I'm sure there's like 5,000 other terms for the same thing, but secondary traumatic stress. And I learned that from Bill Howard that we've had on a couple of times. And so I'd never really thought about it. And then after having Bill on, we had a car accident. with a gentleman that he lost his wife, and I was, taking him food, inviting him to church, and he definitely was not into any of that kind of stuff, and I wasn't pushing it. I wasn't
to church.
Yeah. And so he gets into a car accident. He's very badly hurt. At which point I'm trying to break this window to get into this car.
My gosh.
And, I then am blocking traffic and I didn't know it because you hear autopilot all the time sometimes. I just was there and I was working. That's all there is to it. I can't explain any other emotion.
What you do.
And so I'm blocking traffic and I call my pastor and I'm like, hey, remember that guy I told you about? Cause I'd given him my pastor's card and so on and so forth. And I was like, can we pray for him really quick? And cause he's hurt, and the point with which I acknowledged that, just started bawling, because it was just someone I'd kind of taken, I guess, an interest in. But also even in times where, it's not, somebody that's maybe that close, but you're not a subject of the trauma, but you're there with the person that is the subject of the trauma. So you see it in doctors and in firefighters, EMS, police officers, military professionals, and I would even assume also therapists, because you're literally reliving trauma with those people. So that was another question I had was how do you deal with the secondary trauma? Are you required in any way to seek,
no,
to talk once a year with someone or something?
No, which is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, so I think you answered some of that in your mindfulness of you've got your tools in your toolbox and how you start your day, which is something I learned today because I'm literally that guy that shows up to work 5 minutes before I have to be there. So probably not the best.
Well,
something to shoot for.
And I think, again, that depends on the individual, because you have to remember with my anxiety, I wake up and my anxiety is already amped, my blood sugar's low, or that's how my body's wired to be anxious. So I have to bring that down. So for me, it's necessary to start my day that way. Again, I had a yoga teacher say the way you start your day is your day. So if you're that person that's, pushing snooze, running out the door, pants on fire to get to work, no, probably not the best way to start your day.
That's literally me. That is literally me. That is literally me.
I'll leave you a card. Okay. So secondary trauma, what's interesting is when you were talking about that accident. So you're in the mode, right? You're doing your job, and that's kind of what you do. That's for me too. When I was a counselor and I had to respond to a crisis, you just go, you do it, you get into that, and it's what you're trained to do, right? But that moment when you started talking about praying for him, you shifted into that personal, right? And that's why you started crying, because that wall that you have to put up to do your job, you broke through that. And that's good. That's good that you can do that, but I think it's having conversations like this. It's having conversations at work about secondary trauma. And I rely on people in my life to say, have you taken time off, or you seem stressed, because no, we're not required. We're not required to talk to anybody. I guess it's important to have people to call you out on your shit.
Well, and that was another interesting learning experience too for me as again, I aspire to leadership roles.
Yes.
And so to me, after that happened for the next 2, maybe 3 days, the fire that burns inside me that is law enforcement, rather than being a bonfire, was more like a Bic lighter, in the sense of, the fire was still burning. It just wasn't burning as hot. So if I got a call or I had to handle an issue or whatever, I could, how they have the adjustable, where you could turn the fire up. I could turn it up if I needed to.
Right.
but like it was very much kind of extinguished in my brain, and like my brain felt very heavy. I felt like a cloud. And so I've kind of started to recognize that. And for me, my kind of like self-soothing mechanism is like, I am very recluse. Mm-hmm. And I like to take my thoughts and just mull them over and abstract them and pull them apart and put them back in different ways.
Right.
And then once I'm done with that process of the abstract thought and moving it, and I can move it into the more logical plane, then I'm ready to talk about it. Then I'm ready to move forward. And so it's interesting because I've seen other officers that, you know, can get quote unquote retired on duty where they're not going out and stopping cars. They're not going out and looking for the bad guys. And if they do show up for calls, maybe they're not doing the best job. And that's kind of helped me recognize and see that and want to say what's going on at home.
Right.
You know, what happened at work, maybe like what call.
Yeah.
And, you know, and recognize that. And a lot of times you're going to get the whole like, oh, I'm fine. Everything's fine.
Yeah.
You know, you know, and there, at some point, what can you do with that? I mean, you can't pull it out of them. You know, this isn't Harry Potter where I put a wand on my head and pull my thoughts out, you know,
right.
or their thoughts out.
Right.
But it's helped me recognize that more readily because I used to be of the mindset of like, I wanted to paper that person out of a job. Like you're not doing a good job. You're not being a good cop.
Yeah.
And, you know, God has helped temper me, has helped kind of keep me out of leadership roles, even though I wanted to be in them, to help teach me those lessons.
Right. Right.
And so, you know, and I also feel like if we're, you know, if on the secondary traumatic stress, I feel like when we were talking about the media is I think that we're being exposed to secondary traumatic stress every single day on social media and on the news. And it's like micro in a way, and micro, and it's like just stacking up and stacking up and stacking up.
Yeah.
And then because I can tell you the way I felt as a person when I turned all of that stuff off and I just had the realization of what am I doing?
Right.
And turned that off is I think that we, and I don't know if it's intentional or if it's on accident or they've realized that, oh, well, okay, now we can profit off of this or what, but
what do you think it is? I know.
I think it's profit driven.
We're going to have that conversation when Ted and I come back.
Okay. Well, because I think that those big companies, they pull people in like you, not necessarily you, because I don't think you would, you know, sell your soul this way, but like I'm saying, like, okay, if you really want to get into people's brains, here's what you do.
Right.
And then here's how you make the money off that and sell ad space.
Yeah.
So turning that stuff off has been very good.
Huge.
And telling my kids, like, put the phone down.
Right.
And like when we're in the car and we're driving to Hutch, put it down. Let's talk.
Yeah.
Like give your brain that break. And then
your
also
body.
telling them. Yeah. And the body.
Yeah.
Everything mental manifests itself as physical.
Yeah. Well, in your nervous system. I mean, think about what's happening to your nervous system every time you turn on the news and you see that. I listened to a podcast not too long ago, and it was about, it was titled "Why I Don't Watch Horror Films Anymore."
I hate horror films.
Me
Never
too.
have liked them. Never have liked them. My mom used to. I hate them. Anyway, sorry to interrupt you.
She was talking about how, and you have to remember, Brain Geek talking to Brain Geek here. Like we could talk brain all day long. She was, it was, I'm not going to do it justice, but she was talking about how your brain cannot tell the difference between this is something I'm watching on TV and this is something that's actually happening to me.
Yeah.
Right?
You're feeling the same effects.
Yeah.
Like it's releasing the same, same neurotransmitters in your brain.
Yeah. And your brain doesn't know whether or not this truly happened. And so back to the cumulative effect of that, you know, when you're watching the news and you see that story, every time that comes up, you know, that has an effect, yes, to your brain, but it also affects your body. And that over time is going to affect your nervous system, and it's going to alter your nervous system and your, you know, how your brain responds. They're all tied together. Two things that I thought of when you were talking about that fire, you know, and that fire became just that small flame. That right there is a reason for mental health for first responders. So that person that doesn't recognize that in themselves, I mean, you can turn it back on, but you have tools, right? You have the education, but that person that doesn't have tools, or that person that doesn't understand what's happening to their brain and to their body, how do they ever get that fire lit again? Right?
They don't. I've seen it. Yeah.
They don't. You know, and it's like in the episode that you guys were talking about, I think it was with Bill, you know, leadership that isn't out on the job anymore. Right there. Perfect example, you know, of just that, how not having that opportunity to go out and do that work, you know, has its effect over time. Same thing with mental health, you know. That fire is going out because they're not getting help with those issues.
So with that being said, I've seen a lot of law enforcement agencies that have transitioned into kind of forced, I say, I mean, required, mandatory, whatever word you want to put there. But
right.
As cops see it, forced, like yearly visits at the very least with a mental health professional of some kind. And not in the sense of like a fit for duty, but just in a how you doing, you know, kind of thought process. And so what do you feel on that?
They go one time?
So I say that's the minimum. Yeah.
Well, okay. So for therapy to really and maybe they're doing some sort of assessment or something, but for therapy to really do what it needs to do, you have to be with a person that you've established rapport and have a relationship with. And you know, the first session, yeah, you are coming in and you're opening up, but you're not going to open up in the same way that you are in the 5th or 6th session after you know, have rapport with this person and have a relationship. So yeah, it's great that they are having that check-in once a year, but hopefully that check-in is more than one session, you know?
So, because that's going to be one of my passions, should I make it there, is
No. When? We're going to say when.
No, we're going to go with if.
You said manifestation earlier. We're going to go with that.
Yeah, well, it's just one of the, it's one of those things of, again, for me in my brain, that helps keep that drive for me. Like I guess, let me just illustrate the best way. If I say when I make it there, I feel cocky.
Okay.
I feel like I'm entitled, like I'm saying I'm entitled to something.
I'll allow it.
And so that's why I say if, because I still firmly feel like I am inadequate in a lot of ways, just like you talked about, like when that parent told you,
yeah,
you know, because again, I've never had to really truly lead people. I have in crisis a couple of times and got some kudos for it, but
yeah,
the day-to-day, quote-unquote, mundane, the one time that I did it, now that I've been a corporal, I got my proverbial pee-pee slapped. And so that has also not helped the mental side of that.
Yeah.
But anyway, so back on subject. So how do you do this regularly? Because every time you're always gonna hear, especially from old school cops, you know, it costs too much. I don't have enough people to do it, et cetera, et cetera. And even in today's world of finding enough people to, you know, kind of cover shifts, like now, how do we find the time to then get them mental health? But also when you're requiring them to go, are you really getting the same effect out of it?
No. I mean, I think that's where the conversation has to take place. You know, if people are comfortable talking about it over time or, you know, repeatedly, if it just becomes part of do you guys even say water cooler conversation anymore?
Like in the cop world, they'll call it, I'm not saying
you guys cops. I'm saying you guys your age.
I think
you know what?
Just BSing.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, you know, just that everyday conversation of mental health, you know, coming up, and helping people see, you know, if it's not talked about and then once a year, I'm supposed to go. Yeah. You know, it becomes this foreign thing. And, you know, to your point of cost, I'm so blessed. I mean, wow. I have had the opportunity, 4 or 5 times now, and these literally fell in my lap, to go to businesses and work with them and teach them about mental health of their employees and how that affects their bottom line. And I love it. You know, I'm going back to my educator roots again in teaching. But, you know, a question that I've been asked is, you know, how am I supposed to let these people off work, you know, to go, and then they're not showing up to work, and work's not getting done. And I guess again, what you have to look at is down the line, big picture, the cost cumulatively. And same thing, you know, with cops. Yeah. Is it going to cost a little bit right now? Yes.
Yeah. It's no different than investing in infrastructure.
Yeah. But the cost later is going to be greater if you don't do something about it now.
That makes sense, because if I build a building now, it's going to cost me $1,000 now.
Yeah.
Whereas if I build it 10 years from now, the cost of materials and labor and everything's more. It's going to cost me more in the long run to do that.
Right.
Interesting thought process there. You know, and also one of the battles that I've seen, and a question that I wanted to ask that I've been curious about, is getting like especially elected officials to kind of sign on for the extra quote unquote like rider on health insurances, because again, they're trying to cut costs and all this other kind of stuff. And I'm like, and one of the things I'm going to say is like, I've experienced, seen, and been trained that everything mental manifests itself physically. So we're going to see people going to the doctor more for anxieties, for stomach issues, for, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which are going to increase premiums by however much. Whereas if we give them the opportunity for mental health, and again, we can't force them to do it.
Right.
But one of the things that I'm seeing is, you know, like they were concerned about, like we had an officer that was off for a little bit, and it was like, how are we going to pay for this? And I was like, what? Like, what? Why is that even a conversation? Because when Chad got shot and Bryant got shot and Corey got shot, I went back to my office and my boss said, if you need to talk to somebody, we will make it happen. We will get you time off and it will be paid for. Don't you worry about it, one way or the other. So to me, that was a foreign concept of like, why are we're just now having this we're in 2022 and we're just now having this conversation. You're kidding me.
Well, okay. So let's go back to the cost again. If you don't get help for them now, what's the cost going to be later when that person who is not healthy physically, mentally is out trying to do their job? I mean, you can look at the liabilities side of things. You can look at the cost to their physical health, to the cost to their mental health. I mean, it all adds up. So is it going to cost money now? Yes. But is it going to save you money in the long run? Yeah. It's just being willing to do it now.
And we were talking about that secondary traumatic stress compounding. Yeah. So now you also have the compounding stress. Yeah. That when they finally have whatever that catalyst event is that finally breaks them down. Yeah. Instead of being off work for 2 weeks or 4 weeks, now we're off weeks for 6 months, 9 months, done. Or we're not here at all.
Yeah. Or we're out there doing a job and we shouldn't be out there.
Yeah, for sure. And that's would be the scary part. And also I think that would be the rough part in the dichotomy of a leader, because, you know, like I said, this gentleman that we had, like I was really advocating, you know, with his boss and just saying like, hey, like if I were the administrator, here's what I do, and you can take it with a grain of salt, and just like recommending all these things, and they followed most of them. Yeah. Not all of them, but that brings me to my next point. Was one of the things that was said to the officer was basically, you were broken before this catalyst event happened. Like before this event that your brain just said, I'm full, I'm done. And like I'm in shutdown mode, to the point where he was telling me when he went to put his uniform on, he would be like shaking and sobbing but once that was off, like he was good. Wow. And so it was like, you didn't shoot and kill anybody, you know, and you had these issues prior to coming on. This just kind of pushed it over the edge. Yeah. And like kind of almost that like shut up and get back to work. So how do you feel on that when like people come in, because you can do all the screening in the world you want, the psychological evaluations, and people are good at putting on faces.
Yeah.
We do it every day. Mm-hmm. So how do you feel on that when the sense of like, to me, and again, the way I feel, which people don't always have to agree with, is that moment you were paying that person to do that job. They were there because you put them there. You trained them. You equipped them, you know, all that good stuff. And so essentially in my mind, we broke them. So it's our job to fix them, even though they may have had other issues.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, why wouldn't you get them home? Right?
Well, you asked that question, but there are a lot of people that say a lot of weird things.
I know.
And I don't get it, and it doesn't make any sense to me.
I know.
Because, you know, if you look at it from a pure business standpoint, if you look at the person as a number, as like a profit margin,
right?
Take care of your employee and they will take care of your customer. And in my line of work, that's whomever, you know, they're on a traffic stop with.
Right.
So if that person is in a good place mentally, they're going to handle somebody with professionalism on the side of the road. If they're not in a good place, there might be that asshole officer that ends up on YouTube. Which one do you want to deal with?
Or you push that person who, you know, everybody has a backstory. Everybody has something going on in their life. You don't know what happened to that person before you pulled them over, and you walk up to them and you're an asshole, and that's their tipping point. I mean, again, compounding problem, you know?
Well, yeah. I mean, we respond to those calls all the time.
Yeah.
To where people are in crisis, and now law enforcement officers show up, and now you're pushing people further into crisis. Like we as a profession are good at killing people and obliging them when they want to die. Yeah. Like there are times that it's like, this is not the time to run up there and like take somebody into custody.
Yeah.
Like this is the time to kind of sit back. You know, they're in a room by themselves. Do they have a gun? All this other kind of stuff. Sure.
Yeah.
Do we want them to not have access to that? Sure.
Yeah.
But like now we're pushing ourselves into that room. And I watched a video that Bill talked about from Colorado Springs where this guy just unloaded on everybody because they were forcibly trying to basically commit him. Yeah. And while I'm not saying that we should just, well, all right, good luck with that gun. Hopefully don't kill yourself and walk away.
Right.
We need to kind of stop, slow down, take a step back. And like I tried to tell Eli all the time, take yourself out of your shoes, look at it in their shoes.
Yeah.
And like, how would I want this done? How would I like this handled? And try to look at it through those lenses and come to an amicable solution, which is not always possible.
Yeah.
But.
Well, and I don't want to oversimplify things because, you know, I could never do what you do. You know, I can't imagine what it's like to walk up to a car and you have no idea what you're walking up to, or walk into a room or what have you. So, you know, I don't want to oversimplify it, but you know, I think there's a place for mental health for everybody. Yeah.
So, you know, and another thing is like in all professions, and also in America in a way, some people wear that like anxiety and some of that mental health stuff like a badge of honor.
Yes.
And I'm like, and I used to be that guy of like, I would work myself to like absolute exhaustion.
Yeah.
To the detriment of me and my family, and the paychecks were great. Don't get me wrong. But where did that come from? Why do people do that?
It's society. I mean, people overschedule themselves, and you know, for people to stand up and say, oh, "I'm so busy," they wear that. It's a badge of honor to be able to say that, and it just becomes a societal expectation. Well, we've created a mess.
So how as an employer do you handle that to make sure that, you know, people that aren't going to take time off, like that you're making sure they're getting time off? So like when you're talking about that bottom line with businesses, like, are you telling them to like encourage taking time off and stuff like that, of like, we want you to take time off, please do.
Right.
You know, cause like, my Sarge, he has like 51 straight days of like vacation, and that's not counting like comp time and sick time and all that other kind of stuff. You just never take time off.
Yeah.
But I also don't understand the wearing wearing burnout, essentially, like it's a
Yeah.
badge of honor, like I earned this.
Right.
Like, what?
Right.
What? There's a lot of things in this world to be proud of. That
I
is
know.
not one of them.
And, I think it's getting better. People are, as the conversation around mental health increases, I think, people are getting better about talking about needing time off. And it depends on the individual and it depends on the profession. But I think it just becomes a matter of people like you and I being more forthcoming about having conversations about that. And, just making the workplace an environment where those conversations are supported and welcomed. Part of my spiel that I give to them is teaching them about their brain so that they have a common language that they can talk about, those flip your lid moments or understanding what's going on in, this person's brain when I'm sitting across from you and your lid's flipped, creating that common conversation so that or common vocabulary so they can have those conversations in the workplace. A really good question that some business leaders have asked is, how do I have this conversation with someone? Maybe I recognize in them that they're not doing well, or, it's not like you can go up and say, hey, you need to take a day and schedule an appointment with a therapist,
That probably wouldn't be received well.
No. I think, back to my example of when I started school that year, my principal, once I think it was a year before when my anxiety was increasing. He was the most caring person. We had a great relationship, and he just said to me, you've missed a lot more days of work this year than what you have in the past. And it was not in a critical way. It was in a very caring way. And I was like, you're right. And that was just that person that held up that mirror to me and said, okay, I need to step back and look at this. Why am I missing so much work? And I realized it was my anxiety. And those are the conversations as a business owner or leader that you can have, just getting personal with them about, I recognize something a little different, or you haven't been yourself, see where it leads.
Well, and also when you talk about that common language and stuff, I think it's also good to illustrate points sometimes where, like this deputy that had time off, I was telling him because he was feeling guilty about taking that much time off.
Yeah.
Which I get.
Yeah.
We definitely very much have that, you don't leave anybody behind.
Right.
You're part of the solution, not part of the problem mentality.
Yeah.
We're fixers. So
Right.
we literally venture into people's lives and fix it.
Right.
Which we can't fix our own lives, which is interesting. But anyway, as a whole, as a generic stereotype.
Why do you think I sit on this side of the room?
And so I was telling him, because there was another deputy that he'd blown his knee out on a call, and nobody questioned that. Nobody the doctor said he needed 4 to 6 weeks off. That was understood. He needed PT, and then as soon as he got signed off on the doctor that his knee was good enough, he'd come back to work. Nobody questioned that. Not a single question. And I told him, I said, the damage to your brain is no different than the damage to his knee. It
Right.
needs time to heal.
Yeah.
And you have to work a process with a doctor.
Right.
And while they're not going in and maybe necessarily making incisions on your brain,
Right.
but you're still fixing it, and you're fixing it through a number of different ways.
Yeah.
And there's a process, and then the doctor sets what that process is and the time frame, and then you also have a work fit.
Right.
Where they basically give you another psychological examination to ensure that you are, I guess, good, whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a pass fail on that, but, or red flags at the very least.
Yeah.
And then you come back to work. And so I think if I'm paraphrasing correctly for you when you talk about the water cooler conversation is, so as not, and no matter where you're at, whether you're a leader or whether you're the brand new person at your workplace, is to be able to have those conversations about mental health and hey, I've done it, or this person has, if the person's okay with you talking about whatever, they've done it, or we support you if you want to do it, or talking about the neuroplasticity, talking about the damage to your brain. So that way, when the crisis moment happens, it's like, okay, this isn't taboo. We talk about this all the time. Would that be accurate in the sense of that's encouraging people more because you're essentially conditioning their brain to say like, oh, okay, this is like acceptable. The same way going to the doctor because I got a cut on my knee and I need it stitched up.
Right.
Would that be accurate?
That's accurate. I was in a bank in Wichita for a business meeting group that I belong to last week, and they had a sign that said mental health is as important to us as your physical health. And I was like, good for you. You know, we need to have more of that. They just make it a priority. And
so that leads me into like kind of where our system's at currently. And one of the things I wanted to discuss with you is I just wanted to put it out there of like, I've made this conscious decision that I want to be more active and kind of more of an activist type role for mental health, and not just for cops, but as a society as a whole.
Right.
Because the reason I say that is it is one of the most broken things that I think I've ever put my eyes on, because our mental health system and the way it works. Because the reason I say that is we had a lady that was diabetic and she wanted to kill herself. And so she did so by eating copious amounts of sugar. Like that was how she decided she was going to do it. EMS gets dispatched for a diabetic problem, not for the mental health aspect.
Right.
Takes her to transport her to the hospital because her blood sugar is obviously off the charts.
Right.
At which point, somewhere in that process, they figure out this is how she wanted to try to kill herself. So they do the screening, that we have a tablet that they talk to somebody and that person makes a decision, you know, like kind of what happens from there. And basically, if you have health insurance, you're good to go. If you don't have health insurance, you're screwed. And that's what I've kind of found. And so she had health insurance. And they said, okay, the only place we can find in the entire state of Kansas for you to go is Garden City for a voluntary committal. And once she found out she had to go from Lyons, Kansas to 4 hours away to Garden City, completely away from her support structure, et cetera, she said no.
Yeah.
Well, but she's already now been deemed a danger to herself or others.
Right.
And so the hospital's calling law enforcement saying she's leaving against medical advice. And we're like, and because we're thinking to ourselves when we get dispatched, like somebody came in for a cut or whatever.
Right.
Like I can't just chain somebody to bed. Thou shalt get stitches.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Well, it changes it when a mental health professional has said this person is a danger to themselves. Well, now I am required by law to take this person into police protective custody.
Right.
This is where it gets interesting. So they said, okay, we'll take her into custody. We agree to that. You know, she's a danger to herself or other. So she's now in custody. Well, now Garden City doesn't take involuntary committals, only voluntary. So Garden City's off the table. Can't take her.
Right.
There are 5 people in line in front of her at Larned. And like I've watched people that are in jail that were waiting to go to Larned. They wait for 9 months to get a bed.
Right.
So they literally had to sit on that lady in the hospital 24 hours a day with an officer just sitting there.
Oh my gosh.
And that specific agency was down to 3 officers. They had 3 officers to cover 3 shifts.
Wow.
So they were literally, no officer was patrolling for 8 hours a day. And they were just handling calls. Like there was one of the officers that weren't working, they would get a call from dispatch. Hey, there's a dog loose at 123 Main, and they'd have to come out, get dressed, and go out. And so, what I'm like illustrating is I really want to become like more active in, like, even if there's like, if you hear of any committees or anything at like especially the legislative level, like I would love to be a part of that, and not to say that I have to spearhead anything, but just because I'm watching people that are crying out for help,
right.
And they are unable to get it. Like we had a guy that like he cut his arm like so deep, like this way that you could like peel it back and look at the insides of it. And they were like, oh, you don't have health insurance. So here, if you feel suicidal, call this 1-800 number, go home. And that's like what we're dealing with as law enforcement officers. Yet you've heard me say on the podcast a million times, we can build a multi-million-dollar bypass project north of Sterling, but we can't invest in facilities for people to go and do this. And then we're better as a society,
right,
as a whole,
Right.
We're more productive. We have more GDP. We have all this. Again, if you want to look at this from the numbers perspective.
Yeah. It's that trickle down effect again.
And so it's just absolutely maddening. And that's not the only time we've ever had those issues with that, of where it's like, now what?
Yeah.
Because we literally have nowhere to put anybody.
Right.
And that's not me advocating that, like, we just need to start taking a bunch of people into custody and putting them into facilities, but at least have the availability for them to go somewhere.
Right.
And so, I just kind of wanted to also ask you, like, what are you noticing with the system, and like what's broken on your end that you would like to maybe see like fixed a little bit better, like things that are maybe a little maddening to you?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. You know,
You're on the spot.
I know, right? I think that question is probably timely and is going to be maybe clouded by where I'm at in my career. I recently left the group I was part of, and I'm out on my own, which I love. But credentialing or being able to accept insurance has been an utter nightmare. So I've been able to accept insurance for agencies really off and on since 2008. And I have insurance companies that aren't paying me yet because I had to switch my address. You know, I was part of a group and now I'm by myself. And so I have to start the process all over again. And, you know, I'm still seeing clients and I'm going to be, but not all clinicians are in a place where, you know, I can keep seeing clients and it'll get sorted out. I'm sure I'll be reimbursed for that. But, you know, if you're not in a place where you can see clients and you're not sure you're going to be paid for that, they're not going to see clients. And then that affects client care. Something needs to be done with insurance, and I'm going to take that on at some point. You know, I don't know what that's going to look like. A few letters here and there. That's my frustration, you know, with insurance is a whole nother conversation that we can have.
That's a whole nother podcast, probably.
God, right. Jeez. So yeah, that's going to cloud, my judgment as far as that. But, you know, even in Wichita for, we had a kiddo when I was still in the school system that we took to St. Joe. Police, you know, took him, but the principal and I were there, and we were in the emergency room with that child for 3 hours before, you know, he could even get a room or get a bed. And, you know, mine
with Eli was 6.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And, you know, like I said, even in Wichita where we have agencies and hospitals and services, you know, at our fingertips, it's still not enough.
Well, I say even a friend of mine that he works in the Dallas metro area, like he was even saying like it's even a struggle here. And I'm like, let's face it, there is millions and millions, if not billions of dollars in the Dallas metroplex.
Yeah. That's
floating around.
You know, and that's probably a conversation to have too is, you know, we keep throwing money and I mean, money is what's necessary in some of these situations, but I think you know, something needs to be different at the core. You know, we need to be having conversations about what needs to be fixed. Something's broken and throwing money in it isn't necessarily the answer.
Yeah. Well, if you just got the United States federal government to shut off CNN, MSNBC, Facebook's, Instagram, etc., I think you could fix a lot of issues.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, it's not that easy to just put a pin in that and then say that's the problem. Right. But I think that certainly, again, over and over and over and over is not helping.
Yeah.
So,
man,
that was a lot of fun.
That was fun.
I'm really glad we did that.
Yeah.
We got to wrap it up because the computer says there's only 60 hours and 23 minutes of record time left, so we probably better.
Oh. And I saw you yawn a little bit ago.
So well, I did not sleep good last night. I rotated schedules.
Yeah.
And so I went from a night or evening shift rotation into a day shift today. So I got off at 11 p.m. and had to be back at work at 7 a.m.
Oh, wow.
So it's basically like I tried to illustrated it to my wife one time when she's like, just come home and go to bed. She's like, just go to bed. And I said, babe, that's like you coming home at 5 p.m. and me expecting you to go to bed.
Yeah.
Like you get the opportunity to grab a bite to eat,
right.
Watch some TV shows, get the kids ready for bed, get your decompress time, whatever. Like I want the same thing. I don't. So that shift sometimes is kind of tough for me to get to sleep. Yeah. So that yawn was in no way pointed at you. No. Just so you know.
Listen, I didn't take it that way. And a yawn you should never apologize for. You know, it's your body telling you that your nervous system needs something different. So
yeah, right now my nervous system needs sleep.
There you
100%.
go. There you go.
And plus I have to go get my son from a friend's house, and I told him I'd be there by 9. So I probably should honor that.
Okay. Yeah.
Even though I know we could keep going, but
we could.
We need to keep going with Ted here too, because I know it's something that like he's passionate about as well.
He is. Yeah.
And seeing his viewpoints as well as like his humor that he mixes in with it, like it just grabs your attention just in general.
Yeah.
And not to mention he's not hard to look at. So
right.
That helps.
I always say he's my hottie with a body.
I could just imagine him.
He blushes when I say he's going to kill me that I said that.
Love you, Ted.
Because
we know you're listening. So, well, I think we just wrap it up from here.
Sounds
I was
great.
hoping Nate was going to come in mid-podcast. I was like, dude, just come in mid-podcast, man.
God.
But he doesn't love us.
I was one of those people with that schedule. I need to leave a card for him, too.
Well, hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. And, this was a podcast that we've been really looking forward to for a really long time. I know Jeanine has. We've been talking about it a lot and just finding a time to get together. And I just texted out of nowhere and she said yes. And I was like, yes.
Yeah.
And we got it done. So just, again, we're past 3,000 listens, and we are just truly humbled at everybody that listens and just gives their time. And we just want to just do our best to just be genuine and try to help the best way that we can. And so thank you very much. Leave us a rating and a review. Share our podcast with your friends. If this resonated with you, the only thing we ask is that you just share it and, just get those messages out there. Let people be able to like realize that mental health isn't taboo, that it's okay to, be, damaged or hurt, the same way that you would hurt your knee or your elbow or, cut your skin. So, just check us out on Facebook at The Higher Points Podcast, on Instagram at The Higher Points, and our website, www.thehigherpoints.com. Don't forget, we're renting the studio out. So if you want to start a podcast, cough, cough, Ted, and you want to, record some podcasts, we will let you use our equipment. And that way you don't have to invest in it or even really know how to do it. We can do everything for you, and then you can just post everything. So thanks again, Jeanine, for being here.
Thank you.
And we'll catch up with you guys next time.